For those of you that don't know me, my name's Chris Ashbaugh. I'm currently in my third year of a four-year PhD at SUNY Buffalo, and I'm very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you. Again, my paper is called The Romance of the Impossible and the Reality of Transcendence. Man has always been defined by his capacity for story. In every era, women and men have, through story, bound themselves to the past, both their physical and spiritual ancestors, to the present, their loved ones and compatriots, and to the future generations likewise woven into this tapestry of human narrative. These stories are written in our names given at birth, our vows given at marriage, and across the stones that will one day mark our tombs. They are written in our art as poem, song, and sculpture, on film, on the stage, and in every form of media we so readily consume. In the inevitable circle of imitation of art and life, though we consume story in its variegated forms, we too are consumed by it. We are players and audience both. This harkens back to the very first gift given by God to the world in Genesis 1, time, which enabled both story and song, sequential arts, progression, if nothing else. We find in ourselves the need so strong to embrace one another in story that we share our profoundest thoughts in the most curious ways. There is, at the State University of New York at Buffalo, where I attend and teach, a certain bleak, whitewashed staircase, isolated in the corner of an academic building. On its walls rests the evidence of numerous prior vandalisms, subsequently covered up with dabs of fresh paint, save one small inscription. With each successive line added by a separate, distinctive hand, it reads. I wanted to give you an actual visual demonstration of what it looked like. I was in a bad place last year. I'm in one this year. Everyone is, and it gets better. Each line brings its own questions and revelations. Why does the first author need to share his story at all if the tragedy is past? Why share to complete strangers who can offer him no comfort? What did the second author expect? Camaraderie or justice? The third author offers only the cold comfort of humanism, the lifeless, inductive knowledge that all suffer alike, and perhaps it is implied, suffer alone. But it is to the fourth author that we must turn, who scrawls that triumphant line which has defined all human endeavors. It gets better. Curiously, the motive of our final vandal hardly matters, for his or her sentiment meets reality across every facet of the human experience. From the assurance of a mother to a fearful child, to the philosophical implications of our overly saccharine love songs, to the prayers said in memoriam for the dead. Every one of us clings to the hope that, in some true sense, it gets better. It gets better is quite like a fairy tale ending. It implies an author, certainly, and purpose for whatever dreadful trial we are enduring. It implies hope. By all we know in our real world, that is, the world accessible to the senses, this is merely wishful thinking. But none of us live like this is so. Rather, we live and breathe and work and play in a world that is very much full of the impossible. I use this term to refer to everything in our world that is beyond the physical, to concepts like love and friendship, as much as to narrative devices like sorcery and time travel. All of these hold a certain romance for the human heart, and none of them can be held in the human hand. It also includes those bits of magic we take for granted. Why, for instance, in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, David, you stole my example, should three otherwise unremarkable Gs followed by an E flat be so powerful? Why his rhythm and not another? Some would call what Beethoven did with four simple notes a miracle, but I find it far more remarkable that any arrangement of sounds can quicken the heart or cause us to hold in our breath in anticipation. All the media that surrounds us from the time we are born to the time we pass on is physically nothing more than a stale snapshot of artistic outpouring from another man or woman. And yet, these dots and lines and shapes on a page can bring life to us in a way that can only be described as magical, as supernatural, beyond what we can see and touch, and thus, impossible. Of course, by any modern measure, if our cultural elites are to be believed, the impossible in our contemporary world is dead or dying. From the European Renaissance to the postmodernism of the Cold War era, the impossible has come under fire by an ever-changing cavalcade of foes. The secularization thesis, still in high regard in sociological circles, holds that over time, as a society progresses in technology and sophistication, it slowly erases the significance of religion, spirituality, and all other sorts of impossibility. This process has been slow and somewhat devious. Man himself has been refashioned from a soul in the vessel of a body to a collection of physical tissues and rapidly firing neurons, chemical soup bubbling up civilization from its depths. All of the many, many historical accounts of the extraordinary and the impossible have been carved up into embellished legend and so many fish stories. The truths of the world's major religions have been plundered like a clearance aisle at a supermarket, the shelves of faith and doctrine stripped bare for whatever suits the fancy of each mercenary shopper. Because, as Joseph Campbell tells us, it is the metaphor of the religion that matters, not its truths or its doctrines. And lastly, perhaps most sadly, all the wild imaginings and beautiful dreams of the impossible have been relegated to our childhood, something to be put aside as one becomes a man or a woman. But there is here a fascinating phenomenon. Most of us spend our adult lives constantly indulging in our childish fantasies, secretly seeking, perhaps, to reclaim something of value from our youth. The turn-of-the-century British author G.K. Chesterton, in describing his intellectual journey, wrote that he was like a mariner or seafarer who, setting out from England and hoping to discover some wonderful new continent, instead got turned around and ended up planting the Union Jack on Brighton Beach. Simultaneously, he would experience the wonder of exploration and the nostalgia and perhaps relief of arriving back home. Intellectually, Chesterton set out to discover a new truth and ended up finding an old one, from his childhood no less, that the Christian God's account of things was the most true, the most useful, and the most beautiful, not to mention the most clever. An Englishman expecting to find St. Kitts and landing instead in Sussex might have a feeling of déjà vu, convinced, rightly so, that he had been here before somehow. We ourselves, embarking on a spiritual sojourn for meaning, finding something very much like our childhood fantasies and the biblical morality we learned in Sunday school, would instead have a feeling of déjà su, from the French savoir, already known, as opposed to already seen. We are simply relearning what we once knew for certain in our youth. If the secularization thesis holds true, we should find our popular and critical media transformed, largely rid of the impossible. This, however, is not what we find. Instead, our popular culture is inundated with elves and aliens, magic and mutants, space travel, time travel, vampires, superheroes, apocalypses, dystopias, and above all else, the ironclad conflict of good and evil, guided at all times inexorably by an invisible, benevolent force or being. This phenomenon encompasses all our narrative-based popular arts, but even in our popular music, love is always destiny and hope is always eternal. The impossible, it seems, is continually romancing the human heart and nourishing the human soul. The allure of impossibility is, if anything, far stronger now than it was half a century ago, something we shall explore in short order. But for now, the question is why? Why does the impossible romance exist? This invites two alternate and contradictory explanations. Either we embrace the impossible because evolution has found it useful, because the arcane chemistry of our brain has fooled us into believing it, or we embrace the impossible because it is not impossible at all. It is true in a more important sense, reflecting what the world should and can, and by God himself one day will be. It is true because it says there exists a greater world beyond what we can see, and there does. Every civilization is defined by the stories it tells. The philosophy, art, and politics of ancient Greece were rooted in the Homeric epics. The Romans appropriated these and tried to baptize them into an empire. The Anglo-Saxons had Beowulf at the intersection of the pagan and Christianity, and the English had Shakespeare and Milton at the intersection of Christianity and humanism. What sort of stories, then, do we tell in our modern world? To decide this, I must introduce the idea of resonance, both popular and critical. Only those stories that speak to generation after generation can truly be held to define a civilization. Any art in any medium is held to resonate only if it can capture the hearts and minds of individuals outside the particular time, place, and circumstances where it was forged. A resonant work, we can be sure, has something within it that is so central to the human experience that it is able to dramatically affect persons whom the original author hadn't the faintest idea of reaching. If we find that many of the most resonant works of the 20th century have at their center something impossible, then we can be sure that the current trends of transcendence we see today are not as ephemeral as they might seem. Take as an example the classic 1939 film adaptation of L. Frank Baum's Wizard of Oz. It is certainly beset with impossibility. An ordinary girl named Dorothy is transported to a magical land full of wondrous and terrible creatures, magic slippers, powerful witches representing good and evil, and the ultimate triumph of the good. In any adaptation from book to screen, of course, much material needs to be cut or altered. Appropriate to the cynical time in which it was made, the most significant change from the book to film was that in the original book, written in 1900, all of Dorothy's adventures were real. Oz was a real place that she actually visited. In the film, all of these fantastic happenings were only the result of the psychological churnings of Dorothy's brain after she suffered a traumatic injury. It is a powerful metaphor for the era of the film's origin, that they longed for the impossible, but believed their longings to be nothing more than a dream. Let us jump forward in time to an important 20-year span, the late 1960s to the early 1980s. Across this period, superficially similar works that resonate well still have dramatic differences in their views of transcendence. Consider first a staple of many American childhoods like my own, although looking around the room, I don't know how much this is going to resonate. Too young or too old. The cartoon series originally created in 1969 called Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? It featured the eponymous dog, a talking Great Dane, his slacker human friend Shaggy, their leader Fred, the largely useless Daphne, and the intellectual of the group, Velma. As is obvious from the titular character, this show already begs the impossible, but there's a twist. In each episode, the band of friends would stumble upon a seemingly supernatural mystery, be chased around in hysterics by some sort of ghoul or ghost, and finally manage to catch the villain, often enough utilizing a trap planned by the cunning Velma, and reveal them to be nothing more than an ordinary man. Just like the earlier film, Scooby-Doo involved a purposeful subversion of the impossible. Notice the sequence. A totally credulous group of friends, willing to believe anything, stumbles upon what appears to be an incursion of the transcendent into our mundane world. They flounder about uselessly until the rational Velma uses her cleverness to unmask the supernatural creature as merely a man, driven by greed. By the next episode, the group has returned to their credulous ways, seemingly unaware of the irony. Compare this to the Indiana Jones series of films, first released in 1981. Each time, the eponymous professor, an intrepid adventurer, sets out, totally incredulous, to recover an ancient artifact of great religious or mystical significance, which he does not expect to be a gateway to the impossible. Then, Jones has a dramatic encounter with something beyond our world and is changed by it, often in an incredibly personal and permanent way. There is here no subversion of the transcendent, but rather its affirmation. Consider also, in 1966, the world got its first glimpse of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, a science fiction television show set hundreds of years into the future. In Roddenberry's vision of the future, man had engineered solutions to many of his most pressing problems. Religion and superstition had been eliminated, as had capitalism and the need for money. Even morality was no longer an issue, with man having evolved beyond personal conflict in social, racial, or gender discrimination, or so it seemed. In Star Trek, all the questions of meaning and purpose are answered by man himself, and that in a hopeful affirmative. In contrast, when George Lucas first introduced the world to Star Wars in 1977, he had a very different view. Though Star Wars was futuristic, it did not depict a clean, sterilized world, bereft of interhuman conflict, where the major problems of our modern day had been solved by a combination of human ingenuity and emancipation from religion. Star Wars put on display a rugged world full of broken parts and broken people, peppered with bright points of hope, rooted in the same fertile ground all impossible stories have been rooted in, the trust in forces we cannot see, hear, or touch. All of the futuristic technology in the galaxy was powerless to help Lucas's heroes in their cause. They were instead saved by a transcendent incursion into their mundane world. Now, pound for pound, it might seem that the modern stories affirming and rejecting the transcendent are relatively equal, with all four of the aforementioned examples still resonating strongly today in our popular culture. On closer examination, though, the equity is less clear. When some portions of a work resonate well with later generations, but other portions do not, a kind of resonant decay comes into effect. The work itself does continue to be enjoyed, but it is often recreated to better reflect the culture of the time. If we look at the recreations of Star Trek and Scooby-Doo from the 90s through to the present day, we notice that their anti-transcendent messages are turned on their heads. Newer iterations of Star Trek depict deeply flawed human beings, much like you or me. Admiration and defense of religion and spiritual beliefs, and strong implications of some sort of guiding fate, destiny, or even providence. Newer iterations of Scooby-Doo likewise retain much of the simple formula of the original, but have the mystery-solving gang actually encountering ghosts and demons and other horrifying yet undeniably transcendent or supernatural entities. But what of our field of modern Western art music? Though much of the modernistic music of the past century has been found alienating by the population at large, there are a few composers whose work has managed to reach much wider audiences than is typical of those in the classical tradition. Composers like Arvo Pärt, Henryk Górecki, Alfred Schnittke, and John Tavener all have two things in common. Though their music varies stylistically, most of it is far more accessible to lay listeners than their contemporaries' music, and each of them professed a faith that was foundational to their work. Their religion was not merely an artistic trapping, but an authentic spirituality acting as both the roots and branches of their artistic endeavor. Thus, God was the impetus for why they wrote, while their various religious traditions inspired the particulars of their compositional output. Chronologically, a similar pattern to the fictional stories emerges. Though Tavener was able to write explicitly transcendent music earlier, we see Pärt, Górecki, and Schnittke all embracing their faith in their music and shifting stylistically after the year 1975. Pärt had his new Tintinnabuli style, Górecki had his symphony of sorrowful songs, and Schnittke his requiem. What then must we do with all of this? Engagement of the impossible in modern narrative, and by relation in any other art field, including our own, has been largely relegated to adolescence, or that ridiculed pedestrian institution of entertainment. All of this the world corrals in the supposed naivete of childhood. Those unfriendly to the idea of transcendence see this clearly, and want even that small bastion of wonder and belief stamped out. Recently, at a science festival in England, the eminent biologist and atheist Richard Dawkins quipped that it is pernicious to instill in a child the view that the world is shaped by supernaturalism. Dawkins knows that if we kill the dreams of the boy, we also kill the dreams of the man, and men who do not dream are rarely tempted by the wonders and beauties of the world around them to see behind it all the author himself. But if somehow that innocent and fantastic childhood flame could be rekindled, or better, never snuffed out in the first place, think of the spectacular possibilities of the impossible. The tide has already turned, if the wave of impossibility in our modern storytelling is any guide. Our responsibility as composers, performers, and educators is to kindle in those whose souls we touch in our classes and lessons, and through our performances and other sorts of art, this childlike wonder, to experience this déjà vu and recall what they once held dear. How do we highlight the impossible then? What sort of signs can we use? In his magnificent 1969 book, A Rumor of Angels, sociologist Peter Berger finds several signals of transcendence hidden within our daily human experience. In our tenacious sense of hope, in our childlike play, in our vigorous damning of evil, and in our capacity to laugh despite it all. We do all of these things in our music already. We hope, we play, we damn, we laugh. We are constantly seeking in these organized sounds to pierce the veil of our mortality and touch the transcendent, and in so doing, perhaps, to carry along with us our listeners. When we can demonstrate that the best parts of our literature, our art, our theater, our television, film, video games, dance, and of course music, all rely somehow on the assertion of the transcendent being true, we leave those who listen a simple choice. Either they are miserable marionettes, dancing to their DNA and whatever that cocktail of chemicals produces, or the divine spark in their soul is truly recognizing the handiwork of its creator within itself and on display throughout the tapestry of human narrative, wherein each of us is a carefully woven thread. From that recognition, that epiphany of truth, of a world beyond our own, that each of us instinctively recognizes in childhood, the path from the impossible to the cross can be a short, pleasant walk. Thank you very much for your time. Well, are we going to do questions? We have 10 minutes. Are we going to do it both at the same time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Two great papers, guys.
So here's how we're going to do this. I'll say the first word, he'll say the second word.
Word. Yes. Actually, can I ask you a question first? I had a question.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that.
Okay.
Ask each other.
So I often run in evangelical circles, I'm sure like many of you. I hear the phrase, especially on Facebook, there's some meme going around, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Could you react to that in some way? Deconstruct it, reassemble it?
I'd rather run in evangelical circles.
Yeah, I get it.
Oh, gosh. I disagree. There's a lot of qualified people that God does call, and there are a lot of unqualified people that think they're called. But what do we mean by? How do we really know if we're called or not? So I think that's. I don't think that's a helpful meme.
Question. This is kind of going to both of you. And David and I talked about this a little bit, but I think it really piggybacks on what you said too, Chris. He had the picture of the person who he supposedly listened to rap music, okay? And their experience, the music they listen to helps them define what their experience, what they think their experience should be. And now you're also saying story is that we are instilling dreams. It seems though, and here we are as a group of art music composers, when the majority of the world seems to be in this shallower pop culture, what is our responsibility as both composers and teachers to train those to offer those stories of hope in non-artistic music, in non-art music, or in pop music? I mean, I think that's because that's the question that kids come to me with. How am I going to impact my world when the most of what the world they see is the stories of the dreamers or those who have experiences outside of their own norm?
Well, I believe in a two-step process, and I think oftentimes we skip the first. Well, our ultimate goal, a bit of a selfish one, but we believe it has value and beauty to it, is that their aesthetic standards rise, which hopefully would include more of our music, right? It's kind of, they're helped because we believe these higher aesthetic standards lead to deeper living, a deeper understanding of truths of the world, and greater appreciation of beauty. But I think we skip the fact that it's not that their shallow, maybe tastes and certain things are bereft of all beauty. It's that maybe the standard's lower or the depth of it. And I think teaching them to recognize that they're already surrounded by some of these deeper truths. And that's why I tried to point out, no one's holding up Scooby-Doo as like something that is going to be affecting critical thinking in 200 years. I don't either. But, my enjoyment of it as a child reflected something deeper. I did connect better with the stories where they were encountering something real than some stories where they're encountering something that was essentially false. And I think when you're teaching someone to appreciate the beauty in the world, you say, oh, what do you like? There's a reason you like it. You're connecting with something deeper, even if you think it's just a pure physical, like especially with music, the physicality of the beat. They think that's what they're connecting with. But if they're really to process it deeper and you show them the way, they'll find that there's actually something, another layer underneath the song, something more transcendent that they're really connecting with.
And that's exactly what I was trying to show in the rap music. I would beg to differ with the distinction between art music as being classically centered and all other music being non-artful. I think there's formulaic classical music, and it's just as artless as formulaic popular music. And there is popular style music that is brilliant and deep and rich and really speaks to people. Even if you don't know rap music very well, which I didn't for a very long time, let some of your students who are good students and intelligent people show you what they're listening to, and you may be very amazed. There's some really good things happening in pretty much every style because we have a good God. And He will, and people who are, I would say, responding honestly and maybe resisting some of those things that I was talking about in any style are probably going to be able to reach the same sort of transcendent things. We really are in many ways talking about exactly the same sort of thing. How do we tap into this unseen, invisible stuff that we believe in? And I was just in one little area. I was just saying we actually do this with our work. The way that we manipulate notes is these are theological statements. These are hope statements. These are naive statements of how beautiful and how real and how horrible sometimes things can be.
So trying to tie together several things that have just been said. Maybe the response to the statement, Chris, you made is God calls those called to become qualified to their vocation.
I agree. I think,
pick up on what David said.
yeah, I think going back to story, kind of the theme of my essay here, I think we have to look at our lives like a story that God is weaving. And the amazing thing is He doesn't want us, we're not shovels, we're not spades. He doesn't want tools. He wants people to join Him in creating. I was going to bring up with David's lecture, the Tolkien idea of subcreation. We create because we were first created. We believe it's our highest calling because that is our first imitation of God. And I think, when you sense a calling, you're seeing markers along the span of your life that are pointing you towards it. You're seeing how He fashioned you. And then you're joining Him in the fashionating. We're joining God where we see Him already working. And I think that's how we're characters in the story, but we also help author it with Him, and He guides us through that. I think that's how
It depends on what the definition of qualified means.
Yes.
It's formative too, not just
Yeah, I love David's idea of it's a process, it's a relationship, it's an ongoing, a continual thing. All right, you want to call him?
Oh, Walter.
Yeah, well, as you were sharing with us some of the software that creates these loops and these very familiar patterns that we can then draw in to recreate the Shakespeare Rock Festival, I was thinking about ragas and other Middle Eastern ways of not only having scales but associated melodic and maybe even rhythmic formulae that are the right way to do things in that genre or those genres of music, and kind of a preventative way of doing things not the correct way. And I wonder, maybe we're not so far away from these formulas that are part of non-Western traditions of music.
Well, keep in mind the statement, dominant restatement convention worked just fine for Beethoven.
Sure.
A lot of times, it's the interesting thing. What I like to do with my students is I like to go back and say, what should happen here according to what usually happens. I mean, we're not talking about parallel fifths or that could be too. There's you can take this anywhere, but we know exactly what the right thing is. Or why doesn't this cadence where the cadence is set up? And once we find that and you play it the normal way, you realize it's just as bad as my start Star Spangled Banner version that I can play. And so, but there's nothing wrong with the conventions when they work. They're conventions or they're patterns because there's something good about the these natural patterns. I didn't mean to disparage all patterning. I just meant that in the sense that these are set up in kind of dumb bunny ways and used that way and never responded to, I think that's where the problem comes. You call us.
Two more.
I just appreciated both of your talks so very, very much, and perhaps our ultimate vocation is to always point our world to our Creator. And I especially appreciate the observation about the films. When you were talking about Star Trek evolving, I was like, yeah, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and you're right, it has evolved. And I think that the most popular films, which means we need to try to be accessible somehow, if we're going to point people toward the Creator. I'm thinking about the Toy Stories, the sense of love and servanthood and all of those things that come out of them. To me, they always point to Christ, and I know this is not a question, it's a comment. I just want to say thank you to you both.
And I'd point out that Toy Story, with that particular example, how much more powerful is it that it's, anthropomorphic toys coming alive and having personalities and seeming souls than if they somehow transpose that to a realistic movie. It's more powerful to us because of the metaphor, because it actually reaches the truth better, I think.
Do you know if Lasseter is a believer by any chance? It just seems like all of his films.
Lasseter?
Yeah, John Lasseter, the producer of those films.
No.
He is.
I don't
is.
know.
Oh, I knew it. He had it. See, that's the great thing about great art is you see Christ in it. You can't help but come out.
You want to pick the next one?
Sure. I would just like to comment on the last thing, but even when we don't see Christ overtly,
Right.
my point I hope we would all consider is that I believe the Holy Spirit is still there covertly and shaping our values. Music reveals, shapes, and affirms what people feel, experience, desire, and believe, and it's fun. It's getting in there and it's speaking to us. The song I can't remember your name, or Joel. Sorry.
Yeah, both talks were great. It really reminded me of, I believe it's in Colossians, it talks about Christ being the Word, all things are created through Him, both that which is seen and that which is not seen. And as image bearers, as being images of God, we are called to participate in the act of creation. And more importantly, we are said to be stewards of the earth. And as composers, our job is to be stewards of the sonic order of sound, of all pitch, waves. We are stewards of music. And there's a difference of just being stewards, but being stewarding well.
Sorry, we are out of time here. We do need to get to our next concert, and in particular, Chris has a piece at the beginning of the concert. So we need
yes.
to get here.
You definitely need to get to.
But let's give a hand to both of our speakers.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.